Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Orkney International Science Festival online. Technology has helped us all to communicate around the world, but there's a price, which is that we're all increasingly speaking the same language and sounding similar. The rich diversity of languages, each of which has taken shape over tens of thousands of years, is being lost. The scale of the loss has been realized by the United Nations. Next year will be the start of the UN Decade of Indigenous Languages. But new ideas are being applied to help older languages survive. We're going to hear about ways in which modern technology is being harnessed to help. Some of the sophisticated techniques of virtual reality and gaming technology are being used to help with the teaching and learning of one of the indigenous languages of North America. We're going to hear direct from two of the key people involved. Professor Maya Chacaby is Anishinaabe and a professor in sociology and linguistics. And Maya has been working in the field of community-driven indigenous language reclamation for over 20 years. Dr. William Prensky is a virtual learning environment developer. He's a psychology graduate and he's held appointments in higher education for over 40 years. He's worked at the crossover of psychology education and healthcare for 5 decades. If you've any questions for Maya or Bill, please enter them in YouTube's live chat. We'll come back to these at the end of the talk. And now over to you both.
Thank you. Thank you, Howie. I'm Bill Prensky. I'm the founder and CEO of Chandnul Development Group. And for the past more than a decade, 12 years, we have been creating what we call virtual worlds learning environments, which are somewhat different from conventional VLEs, virtual learning environments, in that they are based on complex gaming technology for massive online multiplayer games. And you enter the world as an avatar, as an image of yourself. It's a persistent virtual world, and the learning that takes place in it is extremely compelling and perseverant. And the data are very clear that there is no disadvantage to students and sometimes a great advantage. And it's natural for students. They've been playing these games, engaged in these worlds, essentially their whole life if they're contemporary students. And so they take to it very naturally. And about 6 months ago, we were put in touch with Maya Chacaby at York University, who came to us with an amazing request and an amazing suggestion that we take a game that she had created, which is a paper and pencil game that she can carry with her, and we turn it into an online game so that it can reach all of the community, the first language speakers, second language speakers, the elders of the tribe who hold the wisdom. And before I turn it over to Maya, I just want to read to you the foundation statement for the UN Decade to explain why we're a part of the UN Decade. And this was from Tijani Mohammed Band, who was the president of the UN General Assembly, 74th General Assembly in 2019. And I'm going to beg your indulgence because I'm going to read it. Every fortnight, at least one indigenous language vanishes from the face of the earth. That's an unqualified vanishes, not vanishes to be reclaimed, but vanishes. The first language speakers, the holders of the culture, disappear. Those are my comments. Languages are the scientific insights, the hints of wisdom, and the community practices that move civilization from one stage to another. And we know from the field of psycholinguistics and other fields that our language defines how we think. If we don't have a word for it, it doesn't exist. And language defines our reality. Indigenous knowledge is critical for humanity's survival. Indigenous peoples have been living in harmony with the earth for millennia. And if we lose all of those insights, everyone, including the United Nations, is extremely concerned that we can never get it back. It will become extinct. And to prevent that from happening, we've banded together to try and apply modern gaming technology to the teaching that Maya is doing, and hope in doing that we can save language. And with that said, let me introduce you to Maya Chacaby. Maya is a lecturer and professor in linguistics as well as the Anishinaabe language, Anishinaabemowin. We are learning to speak Anishinaabemowin at the same time that we're building out the course and game elements of it. And Maya is one of the most compelling advocates and teachers for the language that we've ever seen. So let me turn it over to Maya now. And thank you. Say hello, Maya.
Miigwech. Anin bojo odeme conditioner ka samakin dodam kaminista kwan and dunche I nokom Toronto and digita York University and Tashianoki. Linge nimen wenten kayayan nokom onagoshing miigwechka bija nawa ginawa. Thank you all so much for being here. Anishinaabemowin is the life source of my people, and without this life source, we will cease to exist. That is a difficult and terrifying concept that Assembly of First Nations in Canada has talked about on numerous occasions. And so the work that I do in reclaiming the language is work for my people. Yeah, I have a fancy university position and university degree, but my commitment has always been to my people. I'm from a small community up in Northern Ontario, and my family spans my family relations span the North Shore of Lake Superior, and those are my homelands. And I want all generations, the younger generations and the older generations, to come together and find ways to be Anishinaabe in the world now, not as some frozen in time specimen of study, but how can we live well now? And I truly believe that we can live well now through our language, as it gives us our worldview and our philosophy. Sadly, though, this is not the case. I have some statistics here. I don't like statistics at all. This is just just to show you what's happened over the last 25 years of Anishinaabemowin steady decline. One of the first parts of our Statistics Canada that measures languages back in 1996, they have a number for how many mother tongue speakers of Anishinaabemowin were in existence. And the scary part for me was that a large percentage of those folks were over the age of 60 at the time. And 15 years later, there were fewer and fewer mother tongue speakers, and this was already quite a steady decline. In-home use had declined also quite rapidly with the introduction of televisions and radios and English and new technologies, and there were fewer and fewer people using the language in home language transmission, which is a very important piece of language transmission, and it wasn't happening. The good news, of course, is that there is a resurgence of second language learners who did not have exposure to our language growing up, but have returned to learning the language in their careers as teenagers or as young adults going into college and university. One of the challenges with second language learning was that many of the classes were based on very Eurocentric practices where people were memorizing lists of nouns for our language, which is a verb-based, like 85% verb-based language. They were learning just to memorize some nouns, and they were learning in low context and isolated classrooms without any kind of connection to community and casual conversational engagement. So they weren't becoming proficient speakers. The decline then continued, and I got very scared. The other thing that happened that I didn't quite understand at first as I took on the responsibility for teaching Anishinaabemowin, I didn't understand why the students who were coming in, my fellow Anishinaabe, were coming into class very traumatized and feeling shame for not having the language and feeling afraid to learn the language, or feeling less Anishinaabe, because they didn't have the language. It's such a key factor in our cultural continuity, and they didn't have it. So there was this trauma coming into the classroom. And for those of you who are familiar with what happens when you're emotionally charged or triggered or hyper aroused, you have a very difficult time learning. You have a hard time retaining information when you're in that state. So I had to completely rethink how Anishinaabemowin was taught. And whenever I come to a difficult moment, I turn to our teachings for a better understanding of how to best move forward. So rather than looking to Europe for meaning, I was looking inside of our teachings. And it was so cool because in Anishinaabe pedagogy, we have very formal practices for teaching and learning. And here are some on the slide. I'm not gonna tell you all of them, but here are some examples of all the ways that we as Anishinaabe culturally do our teaching and learning. So this gave me a great idea. I've got to incorporate this into the classroom as much as I can, into community practice, and create all these projects for community language engagement. As I tore open all of the linguistic books, I accidentally became a linguist. I really am not. I started to notice, as I was creating new strategies for teaching culture-based language acquisition, that the grammar systems were also very Eurocentric. So I had to rewrite the grammar entirely based on our worldview, Anishinaabe worldview, and dispel some of the structures that have been put on our language that really weren't our own. So I designed an entirely different grammar structure, and it's super, super cool. So instead of terms like animate and inanimate for different types of nouns and verbs, our teachings talk about everything being alive. So I created, in our language, the idea of bamatase and bamatan as two separate ways of existing. So you have these she-he's, this class of verbs and nouns that are she-he's, and the class that is its. Now, these are not Western categories because our she-he category includes trees, birds, water, minerals, and even your underwear. Interestingly, a spoon and McQuan's is a she-he in our language, but a fork, Jishtaigan, is an it. So these aren't categories that you could imagine if you weren't inside the worldview. And as students learn the traditional stories, they start to understand why some things are she-he's and some things are its. Now here's the super cool part, for me anyway, I was excited. I noticed in the Western written linguistic books on the language that there were 4 key parts of speech in the language. And I was like, 4, I can totally work with that. In Anishinaabe cultural practices, everything is in a circle. And so a circle has 4 quadrants. This is perfect. So I put the grammar system into a circle with 4 quadrants. And it was so amazing that both the Bamatase class of verbs and nouns and the Bamatan class of verbs and nouns, they both worked flawlessly inside a circle. In the Bamatase, the she-he's, there are 7 pronouns. And I don't know how many of you know much about Anishinaabe culture, but we have something called the 7 teachings. And so this tied the learners into a sense of cultural continuity while they're unpacking kind of difficult grammatical structures. They were seeing their traditional teachings and their stories all connecting to the structure of the language, which was so fun and fantastic. I know this is a lot of information here for you, but in under 8 hours of instruction, students were able to, because it's based on our cultural understandings of a circle and 7 beings or seven teachings as the pronouns, the students were able to make sense of this and go so much deeper into the grammatical structure of the language than any of the more Eurocentric classes that they were finding. And I was having students able to understand the grammar in a very, very limited amount of time and feel good about it. But still, this wasn't enough. I was still finding that just sitting in class and doing grammar and practicing making sentences, it still wasn't happening. People weren't becoming proficient in the language. So I didn't stop there. I noticed that much of our ways of teaching are based on stories. So I decided I would create an adventure story of learning the language. So starting with level 1 being that very first quadrant of intransitive verbs for the Bamotisi class of being, the she, he's in the world, they would go on an adventure and they would get to learn what those 7 beings do in all these different scenarios and all these different quests and side quests. And then they would go into level 2 and learn what the conjunct version of that would be. And level 3, the interactive verbs and how those happen. And so we took on an adventure together, and it was super cool. With the story, we developed, the bad guys being the linguicidals, and linguicide is a term we talk about in our decolonization practices and theories as one of the forms of destruction of our peoples and culture. And so those are the bad guys, and everybody in the class gets to battle the linguicides. Every time they learn a new part of the quest, they get to earn points to completely eradicate the linguicidals from our land. The other challenge or opportunity I found in this was that in our communities there's a lot of variation. We have no standard orthography, so we have no one way of spelling anything. We have so many regional variations, sometimes even inside communities, depending on who married whom. There are complete different phrases that are used and verbs that are preferred over others. And I wanted to make sure that my learning environment was one where no matter where you came from, you would see your language, the variation, the spelling, whatever it was you wanted, it would be there. You would be able to use what your grandparents taught you, even if I'm not from your community. And this was, again, another big issue in our language revitalization efforts around people saying, well, that's not my dialect, or that teacher doesn't come from our community, so you're not learning our version of Anishinaabemowin. So I had to rectify that inside of this quest. So in the quest, I created these card sets, and the card sets with all the different verbs, students could actually change the spelling. They could change completely different verbs if they wanted. They could choose their own vocabulary for the quests, their own spelling systems, which means I wasn't forcing people to memorize lists of nouns and verbs. They were choosing what they wanted to learn. I also broke down each of the quests into different types of learners. So you could level up in the quest, you could level your character up to be a great warrior. And a warrior would be the kind of language learner who loves pronunciation. And same thing with the mage, and those are the folks who love translation. So learners could focus on the area of the language they were most passionate about. And of course we had boss battles. Here's some examples of a level. So here's an example of a card set, and I made preset themed card sets for folks, but anyone could change any of the cards to do their own quest. So they have the grammar stuff, the activities, the tally chart for which one of the quests they want to take on. I have it set up so that you can do easy mode, medium, hard mode, and brutal. So you can decide how much of a challenge you want in each of the quests. And then of course you have the dungeon. Anybody here who loves video games know there's always sort of a repetitive, grueling dungeon part of the game mechanic that you've got to do. So for this one, it's, for example, they go back through everything and learn all the tenses. And then a final boss battle. And the final boss battle is all of the learners against, I get to play the bad guy against me as the boss. And this was a way, because all of the quests are very peer-based, conversational, they happen in small groups. This was a way for me to assess the whole class. So it's the whole class against me. And for example, in this one, it's asking simple yes/no questions, and they have to answer them with the correct pronoun. And that's what we would do. And then it repeats itself for each of the 4 levels. So this was incredible. This now has completely changed a whole bunch of ways of teaching and learning the language. The proficiency levels have skyrocketed. I'm blown away at what students are able to do when they go on this adventure with me. But I still didn't think it was enough. I still felt like we have to enter into the future where all Anishinaabeg, no matter where they are, and all non-Indigenous folks, no matter where they are, if they want to learn the language, they're going to have access to it. That they could wander around, not wait for a class, not try to fit into a university program, that they could just go into the land that I created, the world I created in the game. They could go in and explore that and learn the language through virtual learning environments. And this is where my very good friend Bill comes in, and I'm going to turn it over to him. Bill, you are next, my friend.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Maya. So when Maya first presented this to us, we were intrigued, and we began to see how the gaming technology that we apply to creating learning projects and courses could be harnessed in order to work to save the language and to show a way to save languages across the world. And we have become very good friends over that period of time. And working together has been really a privilege. We're at the first stage of the first chapter of the course. The first chapter of the course is, how did we get here? And in order to be able to solve the problem of how we regain control of the language and don't lose it and teach it in the proper way, the first question has to be, as we look back along the path, how did we get here? And that will be the first chapter of the game. There will be a 10-year project to produce this entire game and then to make it usable for all Indigenous languages. So first, Anishinaabemowin, and then other languages as they come on board. And this is going to be a crowd-funded project. It's very important that people all over take ownership of needing to solve this problem. And this is because embedded in the UN Declaration of the Decade of Indigenous Language is the understanding, the endorsement, that if we do not reverse the trend of losing traditional wisdom, we will lose our connection to the natural world. And in order to be able to solve the world's problems, we mustn't do that. So if you want any information about it, feel free to write to us at resurgence@cndg.info. It's right up there on the slide. But this is a project which is going to be across the globe, we hope, and touch people from every continent and every country as we look at the question of how does language and culture communicate itself in a way which can be healing for all of us. So I thank you, and I thank you, Maya, and we would love to take questions now if there are any.
Well, that is fascinating, and indeed the questions have been coming in. First of all, from Richard, who says, first a comment, he says, it sounds rather fun and unlike learning a European language. And here's his question. Do you think the system could be adapted to learn any language?
So from our point of view, yes. From the construction of the virtual world learning environment and the creation of the quests and the gamification of the, that's a word which has been hijacked, we shouldn't use it, using gaming technology in order to engage the students. One of the hopes that May expressed early was that if young people can play the game, which is what we're producing, Biskabayang, that their grandparents might see it over their shoulder and suddenly want to help to preserve the language, teach their grandchildren the language. So the answer is yes, it could be adapted to work anywhere. And Maya has tremendous experience teaching in many different environments using her current game. Maybe Maya, you want to say a couple of words about that?
Yes, my friend Rich, I'm really excited about expanding beyond my territories. I think we're going to take over the world. Don't tell anyone. But one of the cool things about this is once we build the structure, the scripts in my language, they're all done in Excel type things we can send the script for different non-playable characters, for example, to other communities, and they can work on putting those into their language. We change the locale to represent more their homelands. So once we have all of the infrastructural pieces built, I think it'll be a lot faster for us to expand to other folks. The only difference, of course, is what and how you want to teach. And for your language, and I think for many of the other endangered languages around the world, what's really important for us to do is shift from, again, those Eurocentric concepts and start to think, what in your worldview, from your culture, what are the ways that you express yourself in the world? How do you see the world? How are the stories in your culture, those traditional stories, how do they inform the reality of your people? And then we make sure that that's what's embedded in your version of the quests and the storyline. And that's what we're trying to do. One of the things I think it's really important to me is not only having everything you interact with in the virtual world be in the language. There will be, of course, prompts for new learners, but also what we're doing with our partnership with the tribal council we're working with is turning those NPCs, the non-playable characters in the world, into storehouses of traditional knowledge. So they will tell stories, and those stories will then be able to live on in this virtual world. We will have kind of an archive of traditional stories of knowledge from a whole breadth of Indigenous folks in my community, and in that way, those folks may not always be accessible to young people. You can't always go and see that elder. You can't always make it there. Now this is a place where the young people will be able to interact with that knowledge and with one another and create networks. So we have students down in the south meeting students from the far north and making friends in this virtual world like they do with any other MMORPG out there. So I hope that answers your question. Yes.
And indeed, it leads into a question that's come in from Martin. It's for you in particular, Maya. He asks if your approach would be something that could be used for other languages that are under threat. He mentions Gaelic in Scotland, and Martin says his own mother tongue Frisk, which is the language of the Frisian Islands.
And yeah, I think I just answered that. I think it's something we have to work on, looking at the grammar structures of the languages from your cultural worldview and coming up and looking at the stories and how they all fit together. We can't use 7 pronouns and 7 grandfather teachings for your culture, because that's in my culture. Maybe you don't just have 4 parts of speech, but what in your culture could represent those things? That's the cool stuff we can do.
Now, there's a kind of practical question from Richard, and it's about costs. I guess, Bill, it's maybe more for you, because there must be a lot of work that has to go on into both the human side and the technical side.
So without getting specific about costs, this is why we are going for an initial funding round in crowdsourcing, because we want people to understand that they contribute to the fund that will help to solve this problem. The goal is to produce the course and game technology so that it slots in just about where students generally are. So one of the things we know about conventional students, conventional college students, is that after tuition, room and board, their next biggest expenditure every year is in computer games. PC games, console games, that's what they spend their money on. And so we want to slot in to where they generally spend on a computer game, which is about $57 on average. And we want to make sure that we can get it in at that price range so that it's accessible to the largest number of students. And then, of course, to try and get donors and supporters who will buy large blocks of seats, so that they can reach out into schools where the students don't have any money. There are many schools that are really strapped, many communities that are really strapped. And then as we expand to other languages and make it more and more language agnostic, as we create mechanisms for being able to add languages to make it possible for people all over the world where funding is different, where the nature of income and expenditure is different, to be able to participate.
Maya, had you any comment on that?
The language is priceless. So whatever it takes to make this happen is what we're going to find.
I think that's well said. And there's another question, which is about the commitment of the United Nations. They're declaring this a decade of Indigenous languages. The questioners are asking, will the United Nations put in funding, or will it be that their declaration would be a means to encourage national governments or regional governments or even local authorities to do something?
The answer to that is both. The United Nations has put money into working groups on saving Indigenous language. The decade doesn't begin until January of this upcoming year. So we'll see exactly how much money in these difficult times is available from the UN, but they've also encouraged national governments, the World Bank, and others to contribute to saving language and saving Indigenous language around the world.
And Maya, are you seeing support coming in, whether in funding or just encouragement and commitment?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of support. Everybody I have hung out with and talked about this to have been extremely supportive. The one scariest moment for me, of course, was having to go in front of the tribal council elders and present this idea. I was really scared that they have very little experience in gaming, so I didn't want to use the word game anywhere in what I was trying to describe to them. And of course, technology has been used in ways that create so many barriers for them that they're quite frustrated. And so I was scared, but the Elders Council was phenomenal. They have ideas and they want to lead this, and they want to even create their own non-playable character that looks like them telling stories in the world. And so it's even my mom is going to be a non-playable character now and be forever live in this virtual world. So it's wonderful to have the support of the elders.
That was a question that came in, well, two related questions. One was indeed the response of the Indigenous community, but another one was about the response from learners, that the younger people would be familiar with game playing and the technology, but what about older people? And are you finding that, say, mature students can take to this as well?
So in my card-based tabletop game, it's very game mechanic heavy. Like there's still like tallies and scores, and the way that people keep track of their points in the real life, paper version of this is they get stickers from me, and it's hilarious because in game you get rewards for doing things in video game, but in the paper game they also got this reward of a sticker. The mature students, of which many are Indigenous, a lot of our people don't end up going to post-secondary until much later in life. They were running up to me to get their stickers in their book. Like they loved it. This finally made sense to them, and because it's a game, even if they're intimidated by the idea of a video game or a virtual world, the fact that they get to play with one another, go on this adventure, be inside a traditional story. It helped people overcome the shame and fear that often not having your language was affecting their ability to learn. And so they're becoming highly proficient by getting stickers and going on quests, whereas in typical classes that wasn't happening, and they would be frustrated, traumatized, and not come back.
And I think this is an experience which has been repeated across many subjects and many online learning environments. We've put over 40,000 students through our online virtual worlds learning environments in the last 5 years. And while most of them are traditional university age students, most of them are, just because that's the demographic, and they take to it readily because it's comfortable and familiar. We were surprised by how many people in their 60s and older were able to immediately become enthralled with the environment, with the mechanics of playing together, with the badges that Maya is talking about, where you get tokens and prizes, t-shirts, baseball caps are a big popular item. They're all virtual. You can't wear them out in the street, but you can wear them online. And we were quite pleased by the acceptance across all generations. It's a fascinating subject.
One viewer in Murray asks about the impact over time on the arts. You're opening up a new horizon for people. Do you think that this, in the course of time, could influence people in writing or in the visual arts, or in ways like that?
Maya, you want to take that, or you want me to?
I have some things, but you can go first, of course.
It already is and has been in many virtual worlds and in many game environments. Plays are performed, concerts are given, music is written, poetry workshops take place. So it already has begun to influence the arts, especially the visual arts, but not only the visual arts and the plastic arts. And we expect that to become more and more the case as the realism of the platforms increase. So as the realism increases, we expect more and more there to be an influence. And one of the things that it does enable people to do is to collaborate across space and time. There is no place that is not here in a virtual world, in the metaverse, as it's called. So every place is here, every time is now. And so people can collaborate from all over the world. It's not difficult for a high school or any school or a college to say we're going to have a performing arts celebration, and it's going to include people from California all the way around the world and back to California, all the way around the other way down to Australia and back again, because it's all the same place.
In the world, we've already started to see, just in discussions with the communities, some interest in more of the arts pieces. We sent some of the in-game concept art to the tribal council schools, and the young people are starting to write the lore behind the world that we're creating. So they're starting to tell stories of different characters and different trees, and doing their own storying, which we'll put up in the Biscabiang lore part of the website, where people can add to and create things. In my in-person tabletop piece, once we fight the linguicidals in the story and we get to restoring that circle and bringing back the world of Anishinaabemowin, the students, as part of their graduation or their rite of passage for bringing that circle together, they are asked to create a creative piece, an arts piece, whatever their gift is in expression. Sometimes it's theater, sometimes it's visual arts. It's quite astounding, actually, as a way to give back to the communities. So even the non-Indigenous students, they have to create a piece of art that promotes the language, that then is made freely accessible out in the virtual world on YouTube and TikTok and all sorts of spaces, so that Anishinaabemowin is present and other folks can see that it's happening and it's cool and it's hilarious. And maybe they don't pronounce things perfectly after 12 hours, but oh boy, are they funny. So they take on that responsibility, and then because they've gotten so much from learning the culture and the worldview, they learn a lot about themselves, that they want to give back. And this is a way of making sure that they give back. So yeah, I think it's going to have an incredible impact in the arts community. We work right now, a lot of the theorists are working on concepts of Indigenous futurities, rather than placing us as a victim in the past or frozen in time or not able to use our cultures in these in present moments in sophisticated ways, imagining Indigenous futurities as this. And I really see part of this work feeding into the arts community that's focused on that area.
Now we've just one brief question to round off the questioning, and this time it's about collecting the stories. You'd mentioned about gathering stories, traditions, but in practice, how actually is that done?
Relationships first. So I always say the only right answer to questions like that is to have the right relationship. And I don't think it's a job that someone from outside of my community could do. It's a lifelong commitment to relationships where elders and knowledge holders and traditional practitioners feel safe, feel respected, have ownership and control over the process, and know that it belongs to them. So that's the first end of the process. The next part, of course, is working with often very traumatized people to tell stories. And in that, there has to be time for grieving. There has to be time for rage and anger, especially with the elders who have been violently prevented from using the language. There's a grieving stage. And so building in safe and supportive practices to having them tell stories is a really important part of the work. And you have to remember to add that into your time when you're planning these things, or you may not get to the stories. Does that
If I could just add one thing to that, and that's really what we've experienced. What we've had to learn as we work together with the elders and with the tribal chiefs is our job is to listen, not to tell. Our job is to listen and then build the stage on which the play can take place, but not to tell. And as soon as we do that, we feel incredibly honored to be able to sit with the elders and sit with the chiefs and hear what they're feeling as well as what they know. And I can't stress enough the possibility for creating healing communities that represents. And I wouldn't want to end this presentation without saying that it is such a great honor to be able to sit and to listen rather than sit and to tell.
That is so well said. And I had been going to round off with like a couple of notes, but I think rather than me rounding off in a moment, I would like to ask Maya to say something in your own language to end, because it sounds so beautiful. And just before I do that, I should warmly thank you both for an inspirational talk. Thank our technical team for running everything so smoothly behind the scenes. Thank everyone at home for joining us, and mention that in half an hour's time, we'll hear some voices from Orkney, past and present. We've got a new film by Mark Jenkins about Rackwick in the island of Hoy. It's slow cinema with the opportunity to take time to enjoy the images of a walk through Rackwick with the voices from Hoy in our ears. That's at a 6:15. But in the meantime, I'd like to round off. I just think it's the sound of flowing water or the wind in the leaves. It's beautiful to listen to the language. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Maya. And over to you, Maya, to round off.
Nahau, Nikwich. Ninki kikino makome na minapimata suwiko yakana Anishinaabemowin. Ekotash ninki kikino makonin gete kikino matnana na shatapi giwe chakate kintashine. Mihimayunje ge kentamaki e get the pentamoin on an qua get pumuja kewan on an Anishinaabemowin jikanokeak ante yunjiak. Equatash mina gia pagatoya kikno humatonanen taso gijik. Mi tashe wiji I tashi kematiak gia pagatoyak nitinishnabe kikno humatonanen. Nitinishnabe at the sokananen. Nitinishnabe wish kachia shabamatonanen. Yish pintepwe kwek pimatoyak kitam nikina wapentan gakana gekon gananta nanta kikenta me kopanan. Mihuega kikekatoachi I weshka chiayapan. Miigwech Ajay.
Miigwech Mea.